You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. By going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com, you can make this possible. Earlier today, I sat down with a former Tallahassee mayor and gubernatorial candidate, Andrew Gillum. We talked about the issue of voting. Also, again, Florida's Amendment 4 and his plan to register 1 million folks for 2020. We also talked about what Democrats should be doing to specifically, those running for president, to specifically target black men. Here is our conversation. All right, Andrew Gillum, lots of things happening in Florida. We'll talk about voting, but I want to first deal with this whole issue of Amendment 4. I kept telling everybody, I told Desmond Meade, I told Sheena, I said, I do not trust Republicans in Florida. I do not believe that they are going to just easily allow those 1.4 million folks to get registered. And it's no shock that we're seeing Republicans push forward this bill. And of course, Ron DeSantis, the guy who you ran against, said he is going to sign it. They do not want to accept the will of the voters when it comes to extending voting rights to formerly incarcerated.
Yeah, I mean, Roland, they're doing exactly what we expected they would be doing. And, you know, with all due respect to all those who held out hope that Republicans would do the right thing and lavished praise on DeSantis when he first came in because he didn't look as bad as they thought he was going to be. Well, I always kept telling people when they were asking, well, how do you think the governor's doing so far? I said, it's too early to tell. My grandmama used to say the proof is in the eating of the pudding, not in the pudding itself. So he's got to make his way through a legislative session. We don't know what kind of bills are going to end up on his desk, and we certainly don't know what they're going to do with them, right? So everything from now arming teachers to ripping away money from the public education system to the shredding, in my opinion, of Amendment 4 by adding what is equivalent to what I believe is a poll tax, by adding fines, fees, restitutions as a condition of being able to get out there and register to have your rights again. Now, Roland, in the state of Florida, in order to make it onto the ballot, a constitutional amendment to make it onto the ballot, the language must be approved by the Florida Supreme Court. And they go meticulously through every line, every sentence, making sure the intent is extremely clear to the voter, making sure that there's only a single issue. Well, in this case, they went through that process. And Roland, nowhere in the language was there a requirement for court fines and fees to be added as a condition in order to have your rights restored. So the Republicans, wanting to keep that 1.4 million people from being added to the rolls, basically added what is equivalent to a poll tax. And if we are to believe the Brennan Center for Justice's report, which basically said that when those fees and fines are added as a condition for reentry into society, that only 3% of those former felons are actually going to be able to meet that barrier. So if those numbers are to be imposed on Florida's 1.4 million, you're talking about 97% of the people basically not being able to participate in the process. And that's a nullification of Amendment 4. Amendment 4 got more votes than I got. It got more votes than the governor got. It got 65% support of the people of the state of Florida. And yet, in broad daylight, they have undermined the will of the voters, adding a poll tax, which we got rid of in the 1800s.
But it's no shock because if you look at Utah, if you look at Wyoming, you look at, I think, Montana, if you look at Michigan, there are multiple states where there have been voter initiatives, Missouri, where the voters have passed initiatives and Republican state legislatures and governors have said, we don't care, we're going to undo what you, the voters, actually just voted for.
Yeah, listen, man, this is naked politics. This session in Florida, and we've seen this all over the country. You saw it after the Democrats won in Wisconsin and Michigan. The lame duck Republican legislatures then worked overtime to undermine people's access to the ballot box. This is only about power. It's not about democracy. It's not about the Constitution. It's not about enforcing the will of the voters. This is about how do you concentrate as much power as you can, especially before the decennial census and the redistricting and the redrawing of lines so that you can maintain political power for as long as you possibly can, right? So that's what they're doing. Let's not make any bones or mistakes about it. And what we've got to be doing is being equally, frankly, vicious about our defense of the Constitution, which is why it is my hope. One, I'm holding out hope. Maybe Governor DeSantis and some of his friends may be able to prevail on him, that this is not in the best interest of the state of Florida and maybe even his own political interests. Recall, Roland, that maybe upwards of 60% of these folks are white people. All of these folks that are getting their rights back are not necessarily going to be Democrats. We don't know that yet. We're in favor of it because it's the right thing to do. That's why Democrats are in favor of it. But what they're saying, because after January 8th and they saw that the surge of people registering were black men coming out of supervisors of elections office saying, for the first time in my life, I feel seen. For the first time in my life, I feel heard. And it terrified them. And so for whatever gain they could possibly get from re-enfranchising those people, they don't want to take the risk of also us adding new people to the role that can create an X factor and throw in jeopardy their majorities.
Well, this is why I have been trying to make this argument to civil rights groups and others that we have to expand this conversation when we talk about voting rights. I believe, and look, rightfully so, fully understanding Voting Rights Act 1965, understanding the impact, where African Americans have stood on this whole issue of voting rights. But what we're seeing Republican state legislatures, Republican governors, Republicans in the House and the Senate, Republican presidents. What they're doing is they are even denying voting rights to white Americans. Oh, yeah. You talked about Wisconsin, where you had in 2016, a federal judge called in Governor Scott Walker's office and said, the voter ID was approved by the Obama Department of Justice. Why are you dragging your feet in the issuing of voter IDs? Then you have in these other states, when it comes to gerrymandering as well, there was a clerk in Wisconsin who said she purposely moved an early voting location off of a college campus, largely white students, because too many of them were voting Democrat. Moved it to an out-of-the-way location with a small parking lot, hard to get to. What we're seeing is young white voters disenfranchised. We're seeing elderly voters disenfranchised. And so we've got to issue the clarion call to white folks. This ain't just about us. You are also getting screwed, and you better be in this fight. In fact, the Ohio law that went to the Supreme Court that purged the list, where a guy said he was taken off the list because he had not voted in a couple of cycles. That was a white man who filed that lawsuit. And so I think even with Amendment 4, we got to say to white folks, hey, black folks have been fighting this thing. Y'all getting screwed too. Y'all got to get in this fight.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, Roland. I testified earlier this week at a field hearing that Chairwoman Marcia Fudge held down in Broward County at the start of the week. And Congressman Alcee Hastings was there. And I mean, the man is the dean of the Florida of the Florida delegation and knows well these tactics. He said in front of that committee room, listen, black people for 200 years, add to it 400 years, have had to deal with these kinds of, struggle after struggle, suppression, marginalization, being discounted in the process. He said, we're going to persist. But this impacts also white voters, as you have already indicated. Do you know that it was Parkland, Florida, a pretty white area of the state of Florida, obviously where the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting took place? It was the 18 to 25-year-olds whose vote rejection rate was higher than any other area in the state. These were young white voters who had, the suppressive tactics of the right come down on them. Mm-hmm. It is the Florida legislature. It was us, citizens in the state of Florida, who had to take this issue to the courts because they refused to put polling places on college campuses. Just refused to do it. So we had to win that battle in the courts. Your argument is completely correct. And that is that this is, while black people are obviously impacted because of our overrepresentation by share of the population in the criminal justice system. We're 11% of the population in Florida, yet we're 20+% of those who are incarcerated. We know that we're disproportionately impacted, but the consequences of this kind of suppression impacts more than just us. And the broader we can build this coalition, which is why I give credit to Desmond and to Sheena and to the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, because they did try to span outward to bring more people into this process. That's how 65% of people in the state of Florida passed this amendment, because many of them have relatives, husbands, families that are impacted by the effects of Amendment 4. But what the legislature and the governor are telling us is that they don't want any X factors in this process, that they're willing to do whatever they can to suppress whomever they need to suppress in order to maintain their majorities, their narrow majorities.
Let's talk about the initiative that you are launching in Florida. It's somewhat similar to what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia. So explain to folks exactly what this is and the impact you want to have, not just on the 2020 presidential race, but what people need to understand, those state representatives, state Senate races,
Yes.
those school district races. Republicans have a supermajority in Florida, largely because of gerrymandering. And so talk about that initiative.
Yeah, so to your last point, I want to pick up on this. The majorities that Republicans hold in the House and in the Senate and the Florida legislature don't make sense when you consider what happened in the last gubernatorial and U.S. Senate race. Bill Nelson lost his seat by 10,000 votes out of 8.3 million votes cast. My race for governor came down to 33,000 votes out of 8.3 million votes cast. Now, how is it that you can have margins that are within 0.4% difference and below, yet the Republican legislature have 70, of the House members of 120 legislature are Republicans? It just doesn't make sense. That is a function of the kind of work that Attorney General Holder is leading right now around this redistricting effort. These are elected officials choosing their voters rather than the voters choosing their elected officials. And so coming off of my race, where again, 33,000 vote difference with 85,000 votes that didn't get counted, ballots rejected over the state of Florida because of signature mismatch, where the W in your signature didn't match the W in your signature from a year ago, and an untrained person looks at your signature and decides that they're going to invalidate your constitutional right based off of that, right? Federal judges were very clear in the recount process that Florida needed to change that law and that it needed to get a cure process in place that was universal across the state of Florida. So they've already got the law on their side, right? Now what we've got to do in Florida is we've got to get back to our basics. We got to get back into our communities, back into our neighborhoods, talking to our voters further out than 6 weeks before an election so that they know that we're there with them in election cycles and outside of election cycles. And so what we've committed to is registering 1 million voters in the state of Florida. Now, without the 1.4 million former felons returning citizens, we got 4 million eligible unregistered voters in the state of Florida.
4 million?
Right? 4 million eligible unregistered in the state of Florida, right? And so you add to that the returning citizens, we got a lot of runway for getting our numbers up. When Barack Obama was on the ballot in Florida in 2008, Democrats had a registration advantage over Republicans of over 700,000 more registered Ds than ours. When I was on the ballot 10 years later, that registration advantage has shrank to around 250,000 Democratic registration advantage. And at the same time, white 65 and older white voters migrating into the state shifted who votes and the type of voter that's showing up in our election, a more conservative voter, more Midwestern voters. So when Obama was on the ballot in 2008, 65 and older white voters represented 21% of the total vote share. And my election, white voters 65 and older represented 35% of the vote share. So we've had a precipitous decline in our registration, and at the same time, an increase in older white, more conservative voters showing up in the process. And in spite of all of that, and all of the built-in structural electoral disadvantages that we had, we still got closer than we did in 24 years in the race for governor. So the best thing that I could do in this case, Roland, was to put my energy, effort, apparatus, the 77,000 volunteers that worked on behalf of my campaign, the $55 million that was spent trying to make me a household name across the state of Florida, and the 33,000 vote difference that was had, and the 4 million people who went out and vote for us, to get them energized around this effort around registering and engaging more voters and more of our voters.
But registering is one thing, turnout is another. And so I think I cite this all the time. The Tallahassee Democrat had a story that showed how Ron DeSantis won over you. Yeah. And the reality is, and they broke it down by county, you talk about those older white voters. The reality is older voters, whether they are white, whether they are black or Latino, they vote more than anybody else. They are going to vote. It's trying to get those folks who are 18 to 49 to understand the power of voting. And when you look at that particular chart, I would dare say, and I was trying to pull it up while you were talking, the first 12 counties, red.
Yep.
70+%, 69, 68. When you got down to Miami-Dade and Broward, 57. And I have said numerous times, had Miami-Dade and Broward turned out at 70%, you're the governor.
It's all over, but you're right. So listen, we know that everybody who's registered to vote doesn't necessarily vote, but it certainly helps to have more marbles on the table so that if a few roll off, it doesn't cost you the whole election. And so my only point was, and by the way, I want to give credit to many of the groups that were out there doing this work. We were expected to have 6.1 million people vote in this gubernatorial election if they kept track of what the previous trends of every 4-year gubernatorial cycles were like. Well, in this race, we came close to presidential levels. We came close to the same numbers Obama turned out in 2008. We had 8.3 million people vote, and I think he may have had 8.6 million people. So we reached presidential level turnout in the midterm election, a gubernatorial race, more than 2 million more voters than were expected. Young voters doubled their numbers. Black voters, for the first time in the history of this state, voted their share of the population. The problem is, let's get really granular about this.
Right.
In precincts where I won 65% of the vote or more, compared to precincts where DeSantis won 65% of the vote or more, his precincts turned out 10 points higher than my precincts. So even in communities where we have a propensity for voting and the numbers exist there, we still didn't maximize the turnout. We didn't have to close a 10-point gap in those areas. We needed a 2-point gap closing in those areas.
And that's why I think we're talking about being as granular. Earlier you talked about precinct by precinct. I think what happens is a lot of people get consumed by, oh, young voter turnout was this or black voter turnout was this. It's like, no. It's not the percentage. It's the numbers.
Yes.
It's the people who were voting. How many are you turning out? And you have to go precinct by precinct. You have to say, okay, in this precinct, there are 700 registered voters. How many of the 700 voted? If that's one of your areas, it doesn't matter if you got 65, 35, 70, 30, 80, 20 in that precinct. If they had 700 registered voters and only 300 voted, it doesn't matter if you got 70 of the 300. What you needed was 70 of 500 or 550.
That's right. And Roland, so we're now at the level that we're talking with regard to the effort that we're undertaking. The reason I say register, engage, and win as the motto for this effort is because I recognize that registration is just the beginning of the conversation,
right? Not
the end of the conversation. The more important thing is that usually we're not having this conversation, a year and a half out from the election.
Right.
We're in the race to do this in the final month.
Right.
These people ain't heard from us. They haven't seen us in that period of time. And so what I'm trying to convince national donors and donors in my state is we're going to spend $1 billion trying to beat, Trump. This election cycle, we're going to spend that much money. Wouldn't it be smarter to spend early, to do the difficult work of democracy in a time frame that respects the voter, that doesn't expect them to turn tricks at the last minute after a nominee has been selected when you haven't talked to them over that period of time. So we've engaged now over 30 groups on the ground who are our partners in this work, who are committed to deeper level engagement. For every one of those million voters that we bring into our database, we're going to track those folks. We're going to geo-target them. When they open up their social media, they're going to see ads from us that are harder hitting ads. It's why my focus has been on raising 501c4 dollars and not just C3 dollars.
Right.
Because time is out for going into the Latin community and talking about it's your civic right and obligation to register to vote. When Trump is out there telling them we're going to put troops on Maduro and that we're going to bring down the regime, and speaking very, very plainly and politically to them about why it is in their interest to vote for him. We've got to be able to raise the kind of money that allows us to speak politically, hardcore. So while Donald Trump is out there saber rattling for Venezuelans, he has yet to extend TPS to Venezuelans who are fleeing the Maduro regime coming into Florida. So if he means to protect you, then let's hold him accountable for doing that. But who's going to tell that story? Who's going to communicate with the voters after we register them to let them know that this guy is not for you? He's for making you a prop in his rally, but he's not complementing that with the public policy that makes you whole, that sees you, that will represent and respect you when they hold office. So the totality of this work is registration, engagement, and then we turn them out to win, not just for 2020, but beyond 2020.
I want to run this by you. There was a 9-point gap between black women and black men who voted for Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. But there was a 9-point gap between black men and black women who voted for Obama and Mitt Romney. And what I've said to, granted, Democrats, look, they need black votes. Bottom line is they need black votes. Just like Republicans need white conservative evangelical votes. And so I'm saying that because folks want to always say, oh, black folks, why y'all just give your vote away? Well, guess what? White conservative evangelicals don't act like that they're voting their interest. Black people are voting their interest as well.
That's right.
But I've said this to several presidential candidates. You should be holding black male specific town halls. I said you should be having discussions because, see, here's the deal. We're two black men talking. I totally understand all the conversation about black girl magic and the impact of black women. But when Doug Jones ran in Alabama, he got a lot of black men who voted. And it wasn't just black women who voted. And we talk about the same thing, Mike Espy, when he ran in Mississippi, black men voting as well. And so I do not disagree with the targeting of black women. But what I will say to a candidate, they should be saying, what is it about black men that we're not getting and why there's a gap? Your thoughts on that?
Listen, Roland, you won't get an argument from me on that. All due respect to the tremendous electoral power of black women. Black men also have a tremendous electoral power when you organize and you engage us and you talk to us about the issues that matter most to us. Talk to us about the wage gap that exists for us. Talk to us about what it means to get access to small business loans that allows us to turn our dreams of owning a business into a reality. Talk to us about the over prosecution rates in our community and the way in which so many of us are targeted. We do have to begin to engage this thing, and that's why I have never bought, and if I had advice to any of them running for president who are avoiding having a conversation around what your black agenda looks like, I would ask them to revisit that and to do it in a hurry. This idea that the rising tide lifts all boats, when we know that if that were true, the kind of disproportionate inequality that we see in the system wouldn't exist if the rising tide truly lifts all boats. Some of those boats are tethered to the ground. And many of those boats that are tethered to the ground are holding black men and black women in them. And so how is it that we're going to structure a system that sees them and that reflects the needs of those communities? And if we I just saw they did in Texas, your home, on your stomping ground, the women of color.
Presidential
Forum that they did. I completely agree with you. We ought to put our energy, and you ought to be the moderator for it, by the way, into holding the same kind of forum that addresses more directly and distinctly the issues that confront the issues of the black male experience in America. And I think we can begin to close that gap. Again, the other side doesn't have to win our votes. That's why in my friends' timelines, I saw the super predator comments. I saw the comment Bill Clinton made referring to Obama's campaign in South Carolina and the idea of it as a fantasy. Those things were the crime bill. All of that was replayed on rotation. And a lot of brothers who I know and I went to school with were reposting. I was like, man, where's this coming from? So when we talk about Russian bots and their infiltration here, they had a very distinct plan. They didn't necessarily believe that they can convince those voters to vote Republican necessarily, but there was a suppression effort. If we can keep those votes down, keep those from going toward the Democratic side, we don't got to win them. But the truth is we got to lose them less. And that means keeping some of us out of the arena. If we do that, I think it could play a very, very tremendous role in helping to motivate more men of color to participate.
Well, I'll tell you what, Andrew, when it comes to this issue of voting and mobilization, it is about fighting, is understanding public policy. And what I keep telling people, I've never self-identified as a Democrat or Republican. I look at issues. And the reality is when you look at the issues that are being driven by Donald Trump, driven by Republican state legislatures, it has a negative impact on African Americans. And I'll say the Republicans, that's why you're not going to get black votes. But we've also got to just connect the dots to people to get them to understand how all these things are interrelated and how it impacts their life, as opposed to them saying, "Oh, I don't really. This really doesn't matter to me," when in fact every single decision impacts them in a unique way.
Totally agree. And Roland, one of the reasons why we're trying to really ground this effort at the local level is because as much as we want to motivate people around the presidential politics, for some of the people we got to move them on the fact that they're dealing with police brutality in their neighborhood, right, on their street. That they're dealing with a mayor that they disagree with who doesn't necessarily reflect them. They're dealing with a school board. They're dealing with a county commission. And so our ability to help relate voting to how it changes and impacts on people's everyday lives is critically important. I carried Sanford, and we flipped a lot of that area largely because there was a black woman for the first time running for mayor in Sanford, Florida, in an area that got woke up after Trayvon Martin.
There you go.
And the combination of me at the top of the ticket for governor and a woman running for mayor in that area helped to really transform and created the kind of energy that was necessary. So the local piece of it, we got to ground this at a level that people can see their very lives reflected in the issues that are being decided. They already know Donald Trump is uniquely unqualified for his job. But the truth is they felt like they were doing bad before him. They're doing bad through him. And they don't necessarily believe that they're going to do better whichever way it goes, Democrat or Republican on the other side. So we've got to now convince them that is not true and that we got the policies to answer those questions for them.
All right. Andrew Gillum, I appreciate it, man. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, brother. Wishing you well, man. Keep the voice loud.
Will do. All right, folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment. Hey, fam, I'm inviting you to come out swinging and join me for a day of golf at the University for Parents Golf Tournament on Saturday, June 22nd in Southwest Atlanta's Wolf Creek Golf Course. It's a golf tournament with a purpose, a fundraiser for the University for Parents, a program designed to empower parent learners through education, inspiration, and support. And when you empower the parents, you empower the children too. The location of the tournament is 3000 Union Road, and the shotgun start time is 9 a.m. To register, please go to www.u4parents.org. For more information, be sure to call 770-316-3487. I hope to see you there. Now back to your Roland Martin Unfiltered video.